My favorite show growing up was Twilight Zone. Oh my God, those Memorial Day Twilight Zone marathons, I could not peel myself away from those. I love that show so much. Although I think the show could have been called Nice Try, Asshole. Right? Because every episode was someone trying to pull some selfish shit on society, and then the harsh fist of universal karma would come crashing down and teach them a lesson. Like every episode could have ended with Rod Serling going, Archibald Beechcroft dreamed for a world free of people. But in the end, it was this very freedom that knitted his blanket of loneliness. Nice try, asshole.
Where are we?
Shot an arrow into the air. It landed I know not
Where
where.
are we?
Between light and shadow.
Hey kids, welcome to the Rondo Hatton Horror Award nominated Between Light and Shadow, a Twilight Zone podcast. Nominated, didn't win, did get an honorable mention, not as good as an actual win, but still pretty cool, right? Thanks for the votes, guys. I'm Craig. Now, if you tuned in last week, you'll know that not just kidding. We weren't on last week, or the week before, or the week before that, or a few months before that. We've been off the air for a while, taking a self-imposed break, a sabbatical, a vacation, a suspension without pay. But now, we're back. We're rested up, batteries recharged, freshly shaved and showered, and ready to get back to the business of, well, what is it we do here exactly? A quick recap of our format. We take an episode from the first season of the Twilight Zone classic series and dissect it with surgical precision. Well, if your surgeon has had a few drinks first. We then shift our attention to a later episode that in some way treads the same territory. Maybe they have similar plots, or they contain similar themes, similar writers, similar directors. You know, bookend episodes, basically. Example, The Lonely and The Lateness of the Hour are both about female robots. Plus, they're both written by Rod Serling and directed by Jack Smite. So we'd want to look at those two side by side, which we did back in October. Two similar classic episodes compared and contrasted. That's our modus operandi, our deal, our gimmick, our shtick. But we don't always shtick to it. Sometimes we deviate a bit and cover only one episode, but we compare it with something else, like, say, a remake of that episode from the more recent Twilight Zone series. Or sometimes we just cover one episode, period. In fact, we've got a few of those deviation-style episodes coming up. But not this week. No, this week we're sticking strictly to the playbook as we ease our way back into the swing of things. So we took a break for a few months, and during that time I came to this sobering realization that I can't do a weekly show, at least not all year long. So here's my solution. I'll do a few months on, then a few months off, then a few months on, lather, rinse, repeat. Now, we covered 12 out of 36 season 1 episodes in our previous run, so we've got exactly 2/3 of the way still to go. So in this second run of the podcast, we'll hit another 12, and unless something goes horribly awry, New episodes should be dropping about every week or so through October, at which point we'll take another break. Probably not quite as long as this last one. Then we'll come back for the remaining 12 Season 1 episodes. But beyond that, I don't know. My original plan was to revisit all of Season 1. And if things are going well when we wrap it up, probably like, I don't know, May or June of 2018, then we can keep it going. We might change up the format a little bit at that point. I don't know. There are still some bookend type episodes that we can cover together, but I've honestly never looked past Season 1 for those. I can think of a couple off the top of my head. Nervous Man in a $4 Room versus The Last Night of a Jockey. Eye of the Beholder versus Number 12 Looks Just Like You. I'm sure there are more. And if not, then yeah, some change to the format will be required. Maybe we'll start hitting them one at a time, which would probably make it about a half-hour podcast. So there's maybe a bit of mercy in that approach. But that's down the road. Up around the bend, the far-flung future. Let's focus on the here and the now. I don't want to overplan. What's that saying? If you make plans, the universe laughs at you. So now we commence our second run, or second series, or whatever you want to call it. Maybe think of what came before as our first album. And we released a couple singles, we did our tour, and then we went back to the recording studio and tried again. And this is album number 2. Will it be more of the same? Or has our sound evolved, matured? Or will we inflict the podcast equivalent of a sophomore slump upon our loyal followers? Or will we actually improve somehow? I don't know. I'm too damn close to this thing to even see straight most of the time. Now, I can report one important change. I'm no longer recording in a lowly, lonely corner of the master bedroom. Our spare bedroom recently became available again, so I seized the opportunity to reestablish my beloved office/mini home theater/recording studio/man cave. I mean, my recording equipment hasn't changed, so the sonics shouldn't be any different, but I can actually stretch out in here. I can get up and walk around. I can spin around in my chair and see my stuff. Bookcases stocked with books and DVDs and Blu-rays, collectibles and action figures, and after a year and a half in mothballs, my beloved turntable is back in action, and I'm actually spinning records up in here. It feels like I'm recording this in my space, not my space, my space, my environment, the tiny corner of the universe that's exclusively mine. So we're a Twilight Zone podcast, yeah? Well, let's get to it. So far on the podcast, we've discussed several of the recurring themes explored on the Twilight Zone. Nostalgia, that bittersweet tugging upon the heartstrings that the past can inflict upon us. Identity, the way that external forces can obscure or even obliterate one's very sense of self. Redemption, the resounding victory of rising above one's weaknesses or failings. And we see variations on these themes again and again on the show. But there's one prominent recurring theme that we haven't really touched on yet. The idea of cosmic justice. Unseen forces stepping in to punish wrongdoers for their wrongdoings. The yang to the universe's yin. The Krampus to its Santa Claus. The cold, fearsome, dark side of karma. The Twilight Zone is famous, even notorious, for doling out cosmic justice to its shittier, less repentant characters, often slathering the proceedings in a thick, gooey layer of irony. Now this week, we're serving up 2 heaping helpings of corporeal comeuppance courtesy of... you know. First up is I Shot an Arrow into the Air, which premiered on January 15th, 1960. Now, we've talked before about how the order in which episodes are produced rarely matches the order in which they are aired. I Shot an Arrow was the 15th episode aired, but the 26th produced. It was shot November the 3rd through the 6th, 1959. This means it went from camera to cathode tube in just over 2 months. That seems like an easy task now, but back then there were no computers, no digital nonlinear editing, no CGI, no pixels. Human hands using mechanical tools. Just as a point of contrast, the episode that premiered the week after was The Hitchhiker, which was shot 6 months earlier.
Water system ready? I have a complete light. Locks tanking secured?
Box tanking secured.
We open on a rocket, pointing at the night sky from its launch pad. Serling tells us that this is the Arrow 1, the first manned mission into space. There's a launch countdown in progress. And then, not even a minute into the episode... As we pan across the NASA control room, we see a familiar bank of lights that looks suspiciously like downward-facing Pac-Mans, or Pac-Men, I guess? It originated in the 1956 sci-fi classic Forbidden Planet, where it served as part of the ultra-sophisticated Krell Laboratory on Altair 4. This distinctive piece of equipment will appear in several more Twilight Zones. I can think of 4 off the top of my head. Third from the Sun, Elegy, People Are Alike All Over, In His Image, but there are probably more.
3, 2, 1, 0, plus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
So the Arrow 1 lifts off successfully and promptly vanishes from the control room's radar.
So an aircraft with an 8-man crew just disappears like a puff of smoke. One moment she's there, the next moment she's gone. They shot an arrow into the air. It landed I know not where. Nursery rhyme for the age of space.
We cut to a commercial, and when we're back, we're no longer in the control room. We're... where? It looks a lot like the California desert.
First entry, log, Arrow 1, Colonel R.G. Donlan commanding. We have crash landed on what appears to be an uncharted asteroid. Cause of malfunction and ultimate crash, unknown. There was an explosion. The electrical system went out. That's all any of us remember. Any of us being Flight Officers Corey and Pearson and Navigator Hudak, who has been seriously hurt, and myself. The rest of the crew, dead. There is very little left of the aircraft. The radio is gone. The bulk of the supplies have been destroyed in the crash. And as of this moment, there is little certainty that we have been tracked and our whereabouts known.
Thanks, Captain Exposition. I mean, Colonel Exposition?
Colonel? That's odd. Size of the sun, I mean.
Yes, I noticed. It's hardly any different than we knew it on Earth.
Which means that whatever asteroid we've landed on is in the same orbit as the Earth.
Well, wherever we are, it's a cinch it isn't heaven. You can count on that. We've got one thing in our favor. The air is perfect. There's no radiation count to speak of.
That's some major foreshadowing right there. Now remember that, kids. Okay, so right off the bat, Corey is belligerent and combative. He objects when water, which is scarce, is given to Hudak, who is hovering in the vicinity of death's door.
Colonel! This man's gonna die.
If he dies, he dies. But nobody gets behind a push. If he's thirsty, we give him water. If he's hot, we move him into the shade. Then if he goes, we give him a prayer or two.
The men bicker back and forth, which escalates into a bit of a scuffle between Donlin and Corey. Pearson breaks it up with a sobering announcement.
You'll be happy to hear, Corey. He's not going to drink any more of your water.
Donlin then piles some more bad news onto the bummer pile.
Took 4.5 years to build that ship. There wasn't any prototype. Just the one ship, the only one of its kind. And it took 4.5 years to build her. So, if they know where we are and they want to come and get us, they're going to have to build another ship. This is home now, gentlemen.
The men start venturing out to look for signs of civilization, or better yet, water. Tensions gradually escalate as the situation looks bleaker and the water gets scarcer. In the middle of the night, they meet up back at the camp. But one of them is missing.
What about Pearson?
What about him?
You were with him?
He went south towards the mountains. I went west towards nothing.
I told you men to stay together.
Something doesn't sound right.
It's hot out there, huh?
You know it.
Made you thirsty, huh?
I'm getting accustomed to it.
Obviously. Very accustomed to it. So accustomed to it that you didn't drink any water. You were out there nearly 6 hours and you didn't touch a drop.
Put me in for a medal.
Buddy, what I'm going to give you can't be pinned on a uniform. I want to know why you started out 6 hours ago with half a canteen and then came back with a 3/4 full. Come on, Corey. I want to know where you left Pearson's body and what you did with him. Come on, Corey, come on!
Donlin forces Corey at gunpoint to take him to Pearson's body. When they arrive, Pearson's not quite dead yet. He draws a strange symbol in the sand and points up to the top of a nearby mountain before he breathes his last. Donlin excitedly starts climbing, but forgets his rifle, which Corey happily scoops up.
Colonel? 2 men can live maybe 5 days. 1 man can live 10. You'll forgive me.
You killed Pearson, didn't you, Corey? You killed him. You're demented, Corey. You're out of your mind. You've already killed once. You've already...
Corey goes to retrieve the Colonel's canteen, which is now empty since he just put a bullet through it when he shot Donlin. Zing!
And isn't it ironic? Don't you think? A little too ironic. And yeah, I really do think.
Nice try, asshole.
But wait, we aren't done. That's actually not the twist ending. Corey starts his ascent, and as he goes, we're treated to some rare mid-episode narration from Serling. He only does this 3 times in the entire series. Walking Distance, Icing the Body Electric, and here. Now, I don't usually play Serling's narrations because, well, most of the other Twilight Zone podcasts do it, but I'm going to make an exception here.
Now you make tracks, Mr. Corey. You move out and up like some kind of ghostly billy club was tapping at your ankles and telling you that it was later than you think. You scrabble up rock hills and feel hot sand underneath your feet, and every now and then, take a look over your shoulder at a giant sun suspended in a dead and motionless sky, like an unblinking eye that probes at the back of your head in a prolonged accusation.
Serling's narrations are typically intended to introduce a character or a situation, and then to wind up the proceedings at the end of each episode. But here, he's directly addressing a character in the story. The only other time he'll do this is in A World of His Own, but that's part of an elaborate joke that isn't really part of the actual story. But this, he's talking directly to Corey. Corey doesn't hear him, of course, but we do. It's a really effective device. It has a nice, nagging urgency to it. It's like Serling's actually in the story somehow. Oh, there's more.
Mr. Corey, last remaining member of a doomed crew, keep moving. Make tracks, Mr. Corey. Push up and push out, because if you stop, maybe sanity will get you by the throat. Maybe realization will pry open your mind and the horror you left down in the sand will seep in. Yeah, Mr. Corey, yeah, you better keep moving. That's the order of the moment. Keep moving.
So Corey eventually reaches the top and makes a shocking discovery.
Pearson! Now I know what you meant. Now I know what you were trying to describe. Telephone poles. You were trying to draw telephone poles. We never left the Earth. That's why nobody tracked us. We never left the Earth. We just crashed back into it.
Nice try, asshole.
I Shot an Arrow into the Air was written by Rod Serling, but he didn't come up with the idea. Lots of Twilight Zones were based on existing short stories, but this one, someone named Madeline Champion approached him at a dinner party and told him her idea, which he paid $500 for. But who was she? She has an IMDb entry as a writer, but the only thing in it is her story idea for this episode. Serling even gave her screen credit in the episode, which he probably didn't have to do. Rod was a nice guy, damn it. However, she didn't receive any credit when Serling appropriated her twist ending for Planet of the Apes. I guess he paid for the idea, so it was his to do with as he saw fit. Now, this is the first of 3 episodes directed by Stuart Rosenberg. He also did Mute and He's Alive in season 4. He also directed 5 episodes of Alfred Hitchcock Presents. However, he's probably best remembered for directing Cool Hand Luke in 1967 and The Amityville Horror in 1979. As I explained a while back, when I first discovered The Twilight Zone, it was only on Saturdays. They'd show an hour-long 4th season episode, then a half-hour episode after that. So I'd put my Radio Shack tape recorder... okay. I say Radio Shack, but it probably wasn't actually from Radio Shack. It was probably from Kmart or some shit. Pretty sad when I say Radio Shack because it sounds cooler. I mean, I'm not a fan of Radio Shack, but come on. Kmart? We all know.
Kmart sucks.
There's a Kmart less than a mile from where I live, and since they're never very busy, my daughter Kendall used to practice driving in their parking lot. Anyway, so back in the day, I'd put my cheap-ass tape recorder up to the TV speaker whenever the show was on, and then I'd play the recordings back over and over during the week while I waited for Saturday night to come around again. I Shot an Arrow was one of those episodes, and to this day I can basically recite the dialogue verbatim as I watch it. Now, according to the Oregonian's TV listings, I first saw and recorded this one on April 14th, 1984. The hour-long episode that preceded it was I Dream of Jeannie, which I also recorded, but I don't remember repeatedly listening to that one. My box of Twilight Zone cassettes is now lost to time, and I have the show on beautiful, pristine Blu-ray, so I can't complain, but I also can't deny I would love to listen to those lo-fi, warbly tapes again. They're tangible evidence of the earliest days of my life in the shadow of the Twilight Zone. Ha! See what I did there? Blog plug!
My Life in the Shadow of the Twilight Zone.blogspot.com.
Thanks, Dave. Anyway, when I saw I Shot an Arrow into the Air for the first time in 1984, I did not see that ending coming at all. I totally thought when Corey got to the top of that mountain, he'd see a giant lake or a river or a big alien civilization or something. But they were on Earth the whole time? Whoa, my 14-year-old mind was blown. It didn't even occur to me at the time, but I'd actually seen that ending before.
Oh my God. I'm back. I'm home. All the time it was... We finally really did it. You maniacs! You blew it up! Oh, damn you! God damn you all to hell!
So yeah, did Planet of the Apes brazenly rip off the Twilight Zone? Well, not exactly. See, Rod Serling wrote the first several drafts of the screenplay for the original Planet of the Apes, adapted from the novel by the French author Pierre Boulet. That novel was first published in 1963, a few years after Madeleine Champion sold her idea to Serling. So you might wonder if Boulet stole the "it was Earth all along" ending for his book. But you'd only wonder that if you'd only seen the movie. The ape planet in the book is not Earth. It's actually Betelgeuse, where apes eventually supplanted the human population as the rulers of the planet. However, the ending of the book does reveal that apes will eventually do the same thing on Earth, so it's still an Earth-related shock ending. Some years back, an enterprising individual named Roger Alford reimagined Planet of the Apes into a half-hour black and white fake Twilight Zone episode, and it's really cool. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. Now, I think a better fan edit project would be to take the hour-long season 4 episodes and cut them down to 25 minutes. Well, most of them. There are a few that are really great just as they are, like In His Image, Death Ship, and On Thursday We Leave for Home. But the 30 Fathom Grave? Please. Anywho, speaking of videos, here's something else that's really cool. Paul Giammarco, a longtime member of the TZ Cafe Forum and a fellow TZ music aficionado, along with his friend, photographer Sal Capirchio, took a trip to Death Valley in 2010 and tracked down several of the actual locations used in The Lonely, I Shot an Arrow into the Air, the Rip Van Winkle Caper, along with 100 Yards Over the Rim and The Little People, neither of which we've covered here as of yet. Now, they photographed the exact spots seen in the episodes, and you can see slideshows on Sal's website where he compares shots from the episode with their photographs. And it's amazing to see just how little has changed over 50 years. I'll put a link in the show notes. Now, on top of that, Paul created a short video bringing those slideshows to life, which you can view on YouTube. And again, I'll put a link in the show notes. Nice work, fellas. So, I shot an arrow into the air. A couple of minor complaints. Not complaints, just observations. Well, more like questions. When Donlan finds the mortally wounded Pearson, he's able to deduce that Pearson climbed up the mountain and saw something. Those fateful telephone poles. Now, did he do that after Corey clocked him with a rock or before? If it was before, it seems like Pearson would have said something about it as soon as Corey showed up, which would have undoubtedly changed the events to follow. Unless Corey snuck up on him, but that seems like it would have been kind of tough given all those crunchy rocks underfoot. Now, if it was after, well, we see how long it takes Corey to climb up there and how difficult it is. There's no way Pearson could have managed that with a fatal head wound. Or did neither of those things happen? It's implied that Corey did in fact kill him, but we don't see it happen, and we never actually learn the details. Maybe it happened just like Corey said.
I found him. Face down. He must have hit his head on a rock. He was dead.
It's possible that Pearson saw the telephone poles, stumbled on his way back down, and cracked his own head on a rock. Then Corey found him unconscious and took his water. Maybe he's only complicit in Pearson's death because he didn't try to save him. But I don't think there was a good Samaritan law back then, was there? Maybe Corey's only guilty of pulling a severely dick move by making off with Pearson's water and leaving him to die.
Donlin, Pearson, what have I done? I'm sorry.
Well, okay, that sort of sounds like he did, in fact, knock both of them off. Okay, so he's a murderer twice over. Man, what a tool. In fact...
You dick!
The only complaint / observation / question I have is one that's been covered many times in books and commentary tracks and message board posts, so I don't want to dwell on it, but these are highly trained astronauts who are presumably familiar with all the things that might differentiate a different planet or asteroid from the Earth. So how do they not know they're on the Earth? Not only is the relative position of the sun the same as on Earth, but the oxygen-rich air is identical to Earth's too. And there's gravity too. The odds that a different planet or asteroid would have the exact same gravitational force as Earth is probably, well, I don't know if it's astronomical, but it's gotta be highly unlikely. Plus, Donlin is wearing a wristwatch, which we know works since we see him checking it a couple of times. So he knows how much time has passed since they launched. They barely even had time to clear the atmosphere, and they didn't get far enough away from the Earth to even hit an asteroid or any other heavenly body. And would an asteroid even have breathable air? I know, suspension of disbelief, just shut up and go with it, etc. But it's science fiction, so we've got to at least consider the validity of the science. It doesn't make me enjoy the episode any less, but yeah, that science is whack. However, the acting in the episode is pretty great. Dewey Martin is instantly unlikable as Corey, and it's interesting that his name is Corey. Remember a different Corey from a different asteroid? But it's not so much that we outright hate him. I mean, he's not the impish dick that Walter Bedecker was in Escape Clause, but he's also not a full-on asshole like Dan Hodling was in Mr. Denton on Doomsday. The thing is, I kinda get him. They're permanently marooned, or at least they think they're permanently marooned, in a hostile environment that will likely kill them within a few short days. I'd probably be chucking the rulebook too and succumbing to some Lord of the Flies shit pretty much immediately. I'm not saying I sympathize with him, but I do get him. Dewey Martin can also be found on The Premonition, which is an episode of The Outer Limits, and he's not quite as unlikable there. However, he does straight up slap his wife at one point, so I guess that does kind of work against him.
Darling, this has got to make sense. This is not a dream, and we're not dead. Look at me, I'm alive. Now, I know I can't explain it to you now, but we'll figure it out. Now, come on.
Meanwhile, Edward Binns is pretty likable and engaging as Colonel Donlin, the man in charge who's just trying to hold everything together in the face of insurmountable odds. He's rigid and he's by the book, but he's human too. And deep down, he's probably wishing he could clock Corey with a rock and take his water. Edward Binns pops up in a 5th season Twilight Zone episode called The Long Morrow, where he gets a promotion to general. You can also spot him in an episode of The Loner, which is that short-lived Western series that Rod Serling created after the Twilight Zone ended.
Victor, I want you to know that this trial ain't my idea. You want to know what I wanted? I wanted you tied between 2 horses, and each set off in opposite directions. For the first time in my life, I wanted to hear a scream that would make me happy. No!
Binns also played juror number 6 in 1957's 12 Angry Men, which also co-starred Twilight Zone veterans Jack Klugman, Jack Warden, Martin Balsam, and John Fiedler. Rounding out the cast is Ted Otis, who is fine as Pearson. He doesn't get to chew nearly as much scenery as the other two, and his character's pretty vanilla, but he's alright. His acting career only lasted 10 years, from 1952 to 1962, with only 13 films and TV appearances. But get this, in 1960, the same year that this episode aired, he also appeared on the series Death Valley Days, which was a long-running series shot on location in Death Valley. I wonder if repeatedly being dragged out into the desert contributed to his decision to just give up acting. Speaking of the desert, the real star of the episode is the location. It was shot in Death Valley, like The Lonely earlier in Season 1, and like The Lonely, it gets a huge boost in the visuals department. All that desert scenery, those craggy rocks, it looks like the surface of Mars in some shots. I just might mistake it for an alien planet myself. But then, I'm not a highly trained astronaut who should know better. I sometimes like to imagine what happens after the episode ends. You know, if the story continued on. What would Corey do now that he knows they've been on Earth the whole time and that he's probably facing a court-martial, life in prison, maybe even a death sentence? Would he commit suicide? Would he simply run? You know, back then, a person could drop off the grid and even assume a completely different personality with relative ease. David Jansen did it every week for 4 years on The Fugitive. Or would he attempt to hide or destroy Pearson and Donlan's bodies and claim that he was the only survivor? I don't know, because he seems pretty contrite, but man's ultimate instinct is self-preservation. Dissolve forward through the swirling sands of time to April 21st, 1961. The Twilight Zone is well into its second season, and the Soviets just officially lapped us in the space race again by successfully launching the first man into space. Now, we would, of course, one-up them pretty decisively in 1969 when we'd put a man on the moon.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. USA! 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 USA!
But in 1961, folks were probably a bit glum when it came to space stuff here in the old US of A. So when Rod Serling did a semi-rewrite of I Shot an Arrow into the Air, it's probably best that he ditched the outer space element entirely. Now, if you double feature I Shot an Arrow into the Air with this next episode, you might initially think that one is a continuation of the other. The Rip Van Winkle Caper opens where I Shot an Arrow ends, in Death Valley. I Shot an Arrow ends with Dewey Martin finding a highway in the desert, complete with buses and semi-trucks, and the first thing we see in Rip Van Winkle is a semi-truck driving through the desert. Not to mention those beautiful mountains and those giant boulders everywhere.
Rocks and hills, that's all there was, just rocks and hills. Rocks and those scrubby mountains over there.
You say that like it's a bad thing. Anyway, in my never-ending quest to have all 156 episodes of The Twilight Zone take place in the same universe somehow, I like to think that the Arrow 1 crash happens on the same day as the impressive heist that the four guys in this truck pulled off. Now, when we leave Corey 90 miles outside of Reno, Nevada, we drop in on this different and yet oddly similar story unfolding maybe 100 miles or so away. Now, again, I don't usually play Serling's narrations, but here I'm going to make an exception. Okay, another exception, because here he very succinctly introduces all four of these guys and tells us what their roles in the heist were. And he does it way better than I ever could, so...
Introducing four experts in the questionable art of crime. Mr. Farwell, expert on noxious gases. Former professor with a doctorate in both chemistry and physics. Mr. Irby, expert in mechanical engineering. Mr. Brooks, expert in the use of firearms and other weaponry. And Mr. DeCruz, expert in demolition and various forms of destruction.
I'm going to cut it off there, but there's actually more. A whole lot more that never made it into the episode. For some reason, Serling wrote a really, really long opening narration. I mean, really long. in which he laboriously provides the details of the heist and what comes after the heist. Now, I'm never going to win any awards for my Serling impression, but I'll do my best. Here's what you don't hear in the episode. The time is now, and the place is a mountain cave in Death Valley, USA, 113 miles from a railroad track where, at this moment, a train has been derailed and a baggage car containing $1 million in gold bullion en route to Fort Knox, Kentucky, has been removed and is in the process of being deposited here. So far, so normal, but here comes the bizarre part. Because $1 million in stolen gold bullion will be a rather warm item to dispense with at this stage of the game, Mr. Farwell and his associates now enter the second phase of their plan. They destroy their vehicles, all but one, a large truck covered with cosmoline that can remain on blocks indefinitely and made to run when convenient. And like the truck, Mr. Farwell and companions plan to do the same thing to themselves. They will place themselves in a state of suspended animation until such time as, in the vernacular of their trade, the heat's off. In this, apropos of the size of the hall, said period being 100 years from today's date, at which point they will wake up and, as Mr. Farwell says, walk the earth as extremely rich men. Bizarre indeed. But what happens to them 100 years hence, or as of the moment they awake, is even more bizarre. They think that outside of this cave is Death Valley. It is, of course, but it's also the Twilight Zone. So here's the thing. This narration would have taken place after the first scene in the cave, which means we already know all of this. And there's also an error. Serling says the train is en route to Fort Knox, but Farwell says the train is going from Fort Knox to Los Angeles. I guess it's not technically an error since Serling doesn't actually say it in the final episode. But anyway, I don't know if Serling himself made the choice to trim down all that redundancy, or if somebody from the network or on the production staff maybe took him aside, gently suggested it. But it's a good thing either way. It's a real good thing. Anyway, credit where credit is due. I read that from the book The Twilight Zone, Unlocking the Door to a Television Classic by Martin Grams Jr., which, hey, won the Rondo Hatton Horror Award for Best Book in 2008. You know, we were nominated for a Rondo this year, as you might have heard, but we didn't win. Man, I gotta quit dwelling on this whole Rondo thing. So inside the cave are 4 rectangular glass boxes, big enough to fit an adult. They look like glass coffins, basically. We'll see one of them again in the Season 5 episode The Long Morrow, where it will serve the same basic function. Suspended animation.
Night, gentlemen. Pleasant dreams and good sleep. I'll see you in the next century. Next century.
Some measure of time passes and the crooks wake up. Well, 3 of them. There's some question if the whole thing worked at all, since the men don't have beards or long fingernails. De Cruz insists that all bodily functions would have been stopped, and that the hibernation gas did work. And his point is proven when they discover that Irby is now a skeleton inside his glass coffin. A rock fell from the roof of the cave and cracked the glass. Hold up. If the hibernation gas leaked out, then wouldn't Irby have just woke up on his own? Or does the gas somehow induce a long-term coma and maintain the body until it wears off? So removing the gas early means he never comes out of the coma and just eventually dies? We aren't given the specifics of how it works. Yeah, I know. Suspension of disbelief. So it's 2061. The 3 survivors gear up to head into the nearest city and liquidate the gold. But then De Cruz takes it upon himself to mow Brooks down with the truck. The 100-year-old brakes give out, requiring De Cruz to bail out just before the truck goes over a cliff. Side note, it looks like they actually drove that truck off a cliff instead of just using stock footage. Usually you can detect a difference in the film grain, but it all looks really uniform here, even pristine if you're watching it in HD.
Mr. Brooks had a very bad accident.
I keep underestimating you, Mr. De Cruz.
Yeah, well, we'll do it my way now. We'll pack as much as we can, put them in 2 knapsacks, and hit the road.
I can't think of any other alternative at the moment.
They set out, and after a while, Farwell does a little ruminating.
There hasn't been a car. Not a single car. What if...
What if what?
What if there were a war? What if they dropped a bomb? What if this highway stretched to...
Stretched to what?
Stretched to nothing, Mr. De Cruz. Stretched to nothing at all. Wouldn't it be the irony of all ironies? Walk till our hearts burst, carrying all this gold.
Just then, some jets, or presumably the 2061 equivalent, fly by overhead, proving him wrong. It's then that he realizes he's lost his canteen. And then De Cruz pounces.
1 drink, 1 bar of gold. That's the price.
You're out of your mind.
That's the price. 1 drink, 1 bar of gold.
Farwell's just thirsty enough to agree. We then get a nice montage of the pair making their way through the desert, and Farwell periodically buying swigs from De Cruz's canteen. And then...
Mr. Farwell, the rate of exchange has gone up a little bit today. It's 2 bars of gold for 1 swallow.
Farwell has little choice. He pulls out 2 bars of gold and, as he feebly hands them over, drops one. De Cruz laughs and stoops to pick it up, at which point Farwell does a little pouncing of his own. Bam! Death by gold brick noggin smashing. Farwell sets off on his own, carrying a bar of gold in each hand. He soon succumbs to heat exhaustion and collapses on the side of the road. Just then a man arrives in a futuristic car.
Mister, this is gold here. You gotta have it. You gotta have it. Drive me to town if you give me water. Gold. It's real gold. You can have it. I'll give it to you. I'll give it to you.
But it's too late. Farwell dies. The man goes back to the car where his wife is waiting for him.
Can you imagine that? He offered this to me as if it was really worth something.
You know, wasn't it worth something once, George? I mean, didn't people use gold for money?
Sure, about 100 years or so ago, before they found a way of manufacturing it.
Isn't it ironic? Don't you think?
Nice try, asshole.
Oh, snap. All that planning, all that criminal activity, all that misery and suffering, and for what? Nothing. That's what. Crime doesn't pay in the Twilight Zone. Cosmic Justice 2, Evildoers 0. The Rip Van Winkle Caper is directed by Justice Addis, who directed a ton of live anthology TV in the mid to late 50s, but never anything by Serling. That is, until the Season 2 episode, The Odyssey of Flight 33, and he also directed No Time Like the Past in Season 4. And he has another Twilight Zone connection. His life partner was actor Hayden Rourke, who had a minor role in the Season 2 episode Penny for Your Thoughts. He played Mr. Sykes, the guy trying to get a bank loan so he can bet it at the track. So, yeah, I love this episode. Aside from the visual splendor of the location shooting and the great dialogue sparks between Farwell and De Cruz, I love the fatalist, maybe even nihilistic vibe. These are wicked, unrepentant characters doing wicked things unrepentantly, and the universe is having none of their bullshit. All 4 of these men die in various horrible ways. Well, I guess Irby essentially dies in his sleep, but we never really get to know him, so maybe he was a nice guy deep down, so the universe spared him a painful exit. Brooks gets mowed down by a truck, which is a pretty quick way to go, but those last few seconds when he saw it coming were probably pretty terrifying. Farwell basically bakes to death slowly, which I can only assume is a pretty agonizing way to go, but he was the mastermind behind the whole heist, so it's kind of fitting that he suffer the most. DeCruz gets brutally bludgeoned, but it happens so fast that he probably never really knows what hits him. And that's interesting, isn't it? Depending on your philosophical or spiritual belief system, he may have faced some kind of horrific justice in the afterlife. Maybe hell is reliving your death over and over unto eternity. Now me, I vacillate between cynical agnosticism and straight-up atheism, so for me he gets off far too easy. It's still brutal, though.
It is one thing, gentlemen, to stop a train on its way from Fort Knox to Los Angeles and steal its cargo. It's another thing to remain free, to spend it, and spend it we shall.
Farwell is played by Oscar Bareggi in the first of 3 appearances on The Twilight Zone. He'll come back as someone even more evil than a criminal mastermind, a Nazi Capitan, in Season 3's Death's Head Revisited.
You'd like water, number 23575? Is that what you'd like? You'd like water. But why should you care? It's only been 5 days since you've been fed. 5 little days!
Then he'll show up again in Season 4's Mute, where he'll play another German, but not a Nazi. He'll play a telepathy scientist or something. His voice has such a wonderful tone, so much gravitas. Why was he never a Bond villain? No, Mr. DeCruz, I expect you to die. One of his last roles was in 1974's Young Frankenstein, in which he played an unnamed sadistic jailer.
What's the matter? You're afraid of this little fire? This can't hurt you. See?
Or I don't know, maybe sadistic jailer is the character's actual name. You kind of predetermine your child's eventual career path when you give him a name like that. Kind of like naming your daughter Bambi severely limits her options later in life.
I've been this little lady's agent for 12 years, and I'm here to tell you that she's the best little stripper that ever... Dancer that ever came down the pike.
Uh-huh.
Maldito vidrio. Rip Van Winkle. That's what we are. 4 Rip Van Winkles.
DeCruz is played by Simon Oakland, who will return in Season 4 for the aforementioned 30 Fathom Grave. He also enjoyed a memorable stint on The Outer Limits, the episode Second Chance, where he played a 6-foot bird alien. No, I'm totally serious. Wasn't one of their better creature creations, not by a long shot. Oakland also played Lieutenant Schrank in West Side Story, one of Teresa's favorite movies. Okay, I like it a lot too. But he's probably best remembered as the psychiatrist at the end of Psycho, who explains Norman Bates's multiple personality disorder.
Norman Bates no longer exists. He only half existed to begin with. And now, the other half has taken over. Probably for all time.
Blowout, skid marks, shoulders like pudding, and going 65 miles an hour. Lady, you're on the side of the angels. By rights, you shouldn't have called for a mechanic. Somebody should have called for a hearse.
Brooks is played by Lou Gallo, who we last saw in The Hitchhiker as the mechanic who fixes Nan's flat tire at the start of the episode. Or does he?
DeCruz, I wouldn't trust you with gold if it was filling in your own mother's tooth. No, buddy boy. You drive. I'll check the back.
He'll also return in Season 4 in the episode On Thursday We Leave for Home. Irby is played by John Mitchum, who, you know what, I'm not even going to bother. He has like 2 lines and he's dead 5 minutes into the episode. Wait, hang on. he's in another Twilight Zone. Season 5's Mr. Garrity in the Graves. He plays Ace, Garrity's assistant, the guy who magically disappears on cue, and he does have more lines in that one.
Played my part uncommonly well, though, didn't I? What was the take?
Full disclosure time. The first time I guest hosted on that Twilighty show about that zone, which is another Twilight Zone podcast hosted by my friend David Lawler, we talked about the Rip Van Winkle Caper. So I kind of already covered it in a podcast setting. So a few of the points I'm about to make can be heard there too. I'll put a link in the show notes so you guys can check that out. Okay. Like any criminal plot or any Bond villain plot, this one's got a couple of potential holes. First of all, the other three, we'll call them Farwell's flunkies, trust him implicitly. Now, what's to stop him from putting the three of them to sleep and then making off with the gold? Or better yet, what's to stop him from gassing them to death in those glass coffins? Okay, we wouldn't have much of a story, but still, he's clearly the brains of the operation, but he's a criminal. And there's no honor among thieves, so he could have easily quadrupled his take. The other issue, a big-ass cave doesn't seem like the best choice for a 100-year hideout. I mean, what if there's an earthquake? And regarding poor Irby's demise, why are they in flimsy glass enclosures with nothing sturdier overhead to protect them? Why do those boxes have glass tops? Why wouldn't they at the very least have like a heavy horse blanket on top, just in case a rock might fall after 100 years of gradual erosion? And why are they in a cave at all? Wouldn't it have made more sense to sleep for a century underground? Less chance of discovery, right? And Irby's body wouldn't reduce to a skeleton even after 100 years, not inside a mostly airtight glass box. He would have been mummified. But maybe a mummified corpse would have been too grotesque for 1961 television. And here's another puzzler. Farwell is such a genius that he's actually devised a way to put a human being into suspended animation for 100 years. Imagine the value of this. Long-term space travel, extending lifespans. I'm pretty sure the government or any number of corporations would gladly give him $1 million for it, and he wouldn't have to share it with anybody. So yeah, there are some obvious plot holes and some logic fails, just like I shot an arrow into the air, but again, it doesn't affect my enjoyment of it. I love the conflict between the characters, the shift in power from Farwell to DeCruz, Farwell's savage reclamation of said power, and of course the ultimate cosmic sucker punch. That gold ain't worth a damn thing 100 years into the future.
Nice try, asshole.
Serling would later blatantly crib the whole 4 people in suspended animation in glass cases and one of them dies bit in his screenplay for, yep, Planet of the Apes. Even the dialogue is similar. One of the astronauts even compares them to Rip Van Winkle. I don't think that particular line made the final cut, since Serling's screenplay was heavily revised before the film was shot. But this time the unfortunate victim of the cracked glass coffin is a mummified corpse and not a straight-up clean white skeleton. I love the clumsiness of Farwell's murder of DeCruz. He hits him the first time with the bar of gold in his right hand. Then he hits him with the canteen in his left hand. Then he lays down another cassava crush with the bar of gold. The awkwardness seems really realistic somehow. Real murder is messy. It's ungangly. I'd probably look a lot like that if it were me, and not just because I'm a fat guy with very little coordination. Now, I'm guessing the bars of gold depicted in the episode are what are commonly referred to as kilo bars because they weigh about 1 kilogram, or 2.2 pounds, and they're easily held in one hand. Now, the more standard size is the good delivery gold bar, which weighs 12.4 kilograms, a little over 27 pounds, so I think it's safe to rule that one out. Now, on a side note, Good delivery bar sounds like a frozen treat, doesn't it? Like something all the neighborhood kids would come running for when the ice cream truck showed up. Hey kids, when you're stranded in the desert and your water's almost gone, pick up an ice-cold Good Delivery Bar in chocolate, vanilla, and now new strawberry. You know what else I like? I really like that visceral ka-thunk sound that punctuates the pause. Ugh, grisly. Now, of course, that's a Foley effect and not the actual sound of a bar of gold crashing down onto a human skull. I wonder what it would really sound like. You know, this is a perfect opportunity to introduce a new segment here on the podcast. Listeners, we are live on location at my back porch, where we're going to see if we can accomplish a reasonable audio facsimile of a human head being caved in due to blunt force trauma. Now, since I don't have 40 grand available to buy a kilo bar of gold, I'm going to need something else that weighs about 2 pounds or so. I'm going with a standard hammer. And for the human head, well, Teresa and Kendall refused to volunteer, and I can't use the dogs because the ASPCA will get all up in my ass about it, so I'm going with the next best thing. A medium-sized watermelon, handpicked for its weight, which approximates a human head. How much is that, you ask?
A human head weighs 8 pounds.
Wow, that's 2 different clips from 2 different Tom Cruise movies in the same podcast. And no, before you ask, the Church of Scientology is not sponsoring us. I said approximates for a reason. This watermelon is only about, 2 or 3 pounds. Hopefully that won't skew our data too much. Let's get to it. Shit, now there's watermelon juice all over the back porch.
Do you want ants? Because that's how you get ants.
So I paired this week's episodes up for several reasons. Both were shot in Death Valley, both plots hinge on water scarcity, and both have a sort of and then there were none story framework for killing off its characters one at a time. And of course the fact that both of them provided story DNA for Serling's eventual Planet of the Apes screenplay. What else does the Rip Van Winkle Caper have in common with I Shot an Arrow into the Air? Well, we get another Forbidden Planet alert, and this one's notable because it's the only time this particular Forbidden Planet prop will show up on the Twilight Zone. The futuristic car that rolls up at the end of the episode is the same one Robbie the Robot used to shuttle the C-57D crewmen back and forth from their ship to Dr. Morbius's swanky single dad pad. Too bad he wasn't driving here. 2 Robbie appearances over 156 episodes just doesn't seem like enough. Anyway, the car is modified some, but it's unmistakably the one from Forbidden Planet. So I was never a Boy Scout or an Eagle Scout. I never did the whole Civil War reenactment thing. So I've never owned a metal canteen. Now the stainless steel water bottle seems to be all the rage these days. Hydro flasks, etc. But we already own so many plastic water bottles, I couldn't possibly justify buying yet another one. But this last Christmas, Teresa gave me a dirty martini kit, olives, olive juice, and a cool bottle of vodka that came in a stainless steel bottle. So after the vodka was gone, which probably didn't take nearly as long as it should have, I had a stainless steel water bottle of my very own, which, yeah, I think technically counts as a canteen. So now whenever I turn it upside down, I can make that cool metallic echoey water sound that you always hear in old movies and TV shows, like the two we're covering this week. You know, that is strangely satisfying. It's the little things. Another connection between these two episodes? Okay, this one's pretty thin, but both have library music scores in lieu of original music. I Shot an Arrow into the Air has some nice supporting cues, but since it pulls from multiple sources and multiple composers, you don't really get a sense of musical cohesion. That's not to say the music doesn't work, because it does. It's just not terribly memorable, especially if you line it up against the Rip Van Winkle Caper, which is predominantly scored with cues from one source, the Moat Farm Murder, a 1944 episode of the radio series Columbia Presents Corwin, which was scored by none other than Bernard Herrmann. The Moat Farm Murder was a dramatization of court records from a notorious murder case in England in 1903.
As I carried her along, I wished there was a great big furnace there that I could put her in and watch her burn. I thought of cutting her up into pieces and putting her into the moat, but I thought of the time it'd take me, and I was afraid of being interrupted. Somehow I wanted to bury her out of sight, and yet I wanted to keep her by the side of me. So I went back to the field and picked her up again and carried her over to one of the haystacks. I found then that she was getting cold and stiff, for there was a strong breeze blowing and it was rather a cold night. It was a horrible sight to see her lying on the ground, and before I picked her up the last time, I wished that she was alive again, because I thought, after all, she hadn't done me any harm. So I knelt down and kissed her once or twice.
The Rip Van Winkle Caper was the first Twilight Zone episode to use music from the Moat Farm Murder, but it certainly wasn't the last. The Herrmann score is wonderfully atmospheric and unsettling, demonstrating that even at such an early point in his career, Herrmann was a master at crafting ominous, dread-inducing music. But Craig, you say, the Rip Van Winkle Caper isn't a horror story. And you're right in saying that. But somehow the horror music fits really well here. And you know that piercing cue when Farwell kills De Cruz? Yeah, that one. That cue is heard many times on the Twilight Zone, and it's always when something shocking happens. Maybe it's William Shatner flinging open the window shade on an airplane and seeing that hideous gremlin face on the other side of the glass. Or Alan Talbot peeling back the skin of his wrist to discover robotic circuitry instead of muscle and bone. Or the evil Oliver Crangle suddenly shrinking to 2 feet tall. It's probably one of the most recognizable library cues in the entire series. Now, the Moat Farm Murder itself is a great listen if you're into vintage radio dramas. It lived on beyond that initial 1944 production, most notably in 1946 when Orson Welles tackled it with his Mercury Theater Players. Track it down if that's your thing. Or, better yet, let me bring it to you. In your car, at your desk, on the couch, wherever it is you listen to us. I'll release a separate bonus episode in which I'll chat with our good friend Dr. Reba Wisner about the Herrmann score, and then you can hear it in its entirety in context. I'll probably go with the Orson Welles version, even though the Charles Laughton version is the original. Or hell, maybe I'll throw them both in there. It's a straight murder story, so it's more Hitchcock than Serling, but it's still absolutely worth your time. So when you're done here, advance immediately to the bonus episode, if you dare. So if we throw this week's episodes into the ring and let them duke it out, which emerges the king of the sandhill? Man, this one's tough. I like them both a lot. Both are technically superb. This is probably one of those situations where it depends on the day of the week or even the time of day. I think I should lean slightly toward I shot an arrow into the air since it came first, which gives the Rip Van Winkle Caper a slight been there, done that feel. But that's more than offset by the conflict between Farwell and DeCruz, which has a lot more bite than the one between Donlin and Corey. Plus, the murder is much more visceral. I'm going to say the Rip Van Winkle Caper takes it, but seriously, this is the closest one yet. So next week, we'll be stealthily studying the secret life of department store mannequins. Plus, we've got a special surprise in store, so tune in for that. In the meantime, you can find us on Facebook and Tumblr. Just search for @ZonePod and you can't miss us. You can also hit us up directly at zonepod@gmail.com. Till next week, kids, make sure you stay well hydrated. And as always, play nice.
Between light and shadow.